I'm excited to welcome you to the DisOrient Film Festival, Asian American Film Festival of Oregon. My name is Gordon Nagayama Hall, and I'm on the DisOrient Board of Directors. And I'm pleased to introduce you to Antonia Grace Glenn, who directed the feature documentary Before They Take Us Away. And her mother, Evelyn Nakano Glenn, who's a professor of the graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, in Asian American and Asian diaspora studies and in gender and women's studies. February 8th, 2022 was the 80th anniversary of President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 that ordered Japanese Americans on the West Coast into concentration camps. But this film is about Japanese Americans who in World War II, quote unquote, self-evacuated to avoid the concentration camps. So they moved from the West Coast elsewhere. And this is a little known story, I think, even in the Japanese American community. So I want to ask Antonia, and then perhaps Evelyn can speak to this too. How did you become interested in this story? I'm a Japanese American. My mother was in Poston during World War II. I've lived in all along the West Coast, and I know a little bit about the story, but you've captured a story that's overlooked. So how did you become interested in this story?
Well, I will actually throw that question over to my mother because she's a scholar and was the founding director of the Center for Race and Gender at UC Berkeley. And so really this project came out of her research. And so she is the one who conducted all of the interviews. And so really the project originated with her. And so she came to me when she had finished filming all of the interviews with these self-evacuees and sort of talked to me about creating a film project because we had recently completed production on my first documentary, The Ito Sisters, An American Story, which tells the story of my grandmother, my mother's mother, and my great aunts and their experience, both as the children of Japanese immigrants growing up in a farming community in the Sacramento Delta, and then through their experience of wartime incarceration and beyond. So I just recently finished working on that film, and my mother had been, conducting these interviews. So she came to me, and we agreed that it would make a really interesting story because, as you say, these are really kind of unknown parts, unknown chapters of this history. So I'll turn it over to my mother to talk about the genesis of the idea.
Yes, the idea came to me perhaps about 10 years ago. Two experiences. One with one of my cousin's husbands who, in the course of a visit with him, talked about his experience as a self-evacuee where his family had been farming in Southern California. His father was arrested and detained in a facility right after the war broke out. And the father then contacted my cousin's husband, Tak's brother, and said that the family should leave California if at all possible. And then Tak told me of many of the hardships that they experienced after they left with two other families to go to Colorado. And they actually had great difficulty making a living. And I just found his story very interesting. And then another encounter with a former neighbor of mine who lived a few doors down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her husband was a professor at the School of Theology. He was also a Jodo Shinshu priest. And she told me about her experience leaving California with her father and going to Utah. And, what struck me was a couple of things. One is something that was confirmed by subsequent stories is that many of the people who fled, first of all, had the wherewithal to leave because they had to leave very quickly, and also that they they were fearful about what would happen to them if they actually went to the concentration camps. We know now that it was not a death camp, but nonetheless, I think in that early period, some people felt that they could be exterminated or, be subject to inhuman treatment. So I think the people who left often had those kind of more explicit fears than perhaps the evacuees actually felt at the time, because of course it turned out that it wasn't a death camp. But I think the great deal of fear and uncertainty is highlighted by the self-evacuees. I thought that was striking. And then the other thing that was striking was just the great, huge variety of experiences and the kind of reception they receive, with some people really being subject to a lot of racist attacks, and often essentially being unable to feed themselves, unable to make a living and feed themselves. So I just felt that those stories needed to be told, and it was something that was not integrated into Japanese American history.
Thanks. That's helpful. So along that line, you had several people who had a wide range of experiences, as you said. How did you locate those who participated in your film, and how did you gain their trust and cooperation to be in the film?
Well, as I said, there was my cousin, and then his family self-evacuated with two other extended families. So I kind of started with that, and then it turned out that a member of my temple was part of what was known as the Keatley colony, and that involved a large number of families from the Oakland area. Many of them were produce store owners, and then other extended kin. And so that was kind of a large group that I started with. I was able to interview both the Keatley people, the survivors of that, and then the one related to my cousin. I also put out calls to people through various Japanese American outlets to try to find people and people who would agree to be interviewed. And I decided early on to try and create as high quality videos as I could. As it turned out, they weren't necessarily of great quality, but they were better than the ones that we started with our first project, the Ito sisters, which were more like home movies. So it was kind of like a snowball sample too, where people that I interviewed also knew other people who had self-evacuated as well. So that's how I created the sample.
Thanks. So Antonia, tell us about the production of the film. So part of it is the quality, and also there were many historic photos and historic film footage, which was impressive. So how did you get that footage? And then also in terms of the production quality, tell us a bit about that.
So in terms of the photographs, a lot of the images came from Densho, which is a really valuable resource of archival materials of the Japanese American wartime experience. I think the one thing that's notable is that there's actually a fair amount of photographic record of the camp experience, but the self-evacuees largely did not have photographs because so many families had to get rid of everything when they had to leave so quickly. And so we've asked members of the self-evacuee community for photographs, and a lot of them said, we really don't have anything from before the war, during the war, or even shortly thereafter, because they just had such limited financial resources. So that part was kind of challenging, is not having necessarily a photographic record of the self-evacuees. The footage, we did research and managed to find, some really excellent archival footage from the Internet Archive. And we have a great production team, a fantastic editor, Tim Becker, our composer, Dave Iwataki, who is one of the founding members of the band Hiroshima. He did the original music for the Ito sisters, and so he's also composed a beautiful score for this film. We have a wonderful graphic artist named Leah Nichols, who is creating a lot of the movement in the film, because again, one of the challenges is having not necessarily that much original material from the self-evacuees themselves. And so being able to kind of bring to life aspects of their journey, bringing to life the movement of what it was like to kind of have to evacuate from the West Coast and head inland. So that, being able to have like a really great production team has been really valuable in bringing those aspects of the storytelling to life. And then we also have, wonderful scholars. We have, of course, my mother serving as the presenter, and we sort of joke that she's the next Henry Louis Gates, as she kind of guides us through this storytelling that is, both her own research, but then also, very personal to her as someone who survived the camp experience and the forced removal herself as a child. And then we have Michael Omi, who is, a fantastic scholar at UC Berkeley. And then we have a couple of community activists as well, who provide commentary in the film. And so trying to weave together those elements around this storytelling it's been a great experience for me. And also, finding these archival newspapers, my mom made reference to the Keatley colony, finding newspapers that talk about that experience and seeing the depiction of the arrival of Japanese Americans in this region, seeing how initially they were met with, distrust. And there's, newspaper articles about dynamite being thrown at the colonists when they first arrived. And then as this colony starts farming in this area that really was not farmable, the land was rocks and sagebrush, and nobody had farmed there before. And this group of people worked so incredibly hard, and they converted this land, and they put up the sign that it was food for freedom. And then suddenly the newspaper coverage of the colony really shifted, and you would see them talking about, well, they're just trying to, kind of gain a hold here, and they're really growing food for freedom. And then they sent this box of produce to the governor of Utah, who had been very anti-Japanese. And he responded with this fantastic letter thanking them for the produce and saying he was so proud of them. And so just being able to find these newspaper articles that really tracked the change in the public discourse in response to the Keatley colony because of their success and their, sort of the notion of their patriotism in the face of hardship, I just was really struck by that. So that has really, for me, kind of helped to provide kind of deeper context and background and history and culture for the really beautiful personal stories that my mother collected through her interviews.
Thanks. That's I'm just impressed with the breadth and depth of this story because as we've discussed, it was something that's been overlooked and some of the records were limited. I also liked how you let the people in the film tell their own story. And yes, you did have expert commentary, such as Michael Omi and others, but you let the persons in the story tell their own story. And it was so varied. I mean, I think everybody faced some levels of discrimination. There were sort of these occasionally individuals who helped or assisted or changed their mind. And some went to places where there were other Japanese Americans, such as the Keatley colony, whereas others went to places that were very isolated. And actually, one of the persons in the film, Edward Iwamoto, was a minister in Seattle in the 1970s when I was living there. And I was at the Japanese Presbyterian Church, and he was at Blaine Memorial United Methodist Church. We had interchurch activities at times. And I met him, but I didn't know his story. But he had us do square dancing. And I had no idea that he'd been in Oklahoma, and I'm thinking maybe that's, maybe that's the origin of that. But I guess I want you to, without giving the film away and without trying to, sort of impose an interpretation on this. What was it like? I mean, how did it differ for people who went to a community where there were at least a few other Japanese Americans and others, perhaps like Edward Iwamoto, who went to a place where they were the only ones or one of a few?
Mom, do you want to speak to that? Because I think we really do see a big contrast between people who arrived where there was some established Japanese American presence and people who were, often the very first, not only Japanese, but Asian, family to arrive in that region. Do you want to speak to that, Mom?
I was going to say, I think among those who were, in a sense, more isolated from other Japanese Americans, I think the range of experiences was quite markedly different. There was one family that went, for example, to Madison, Wisconsin, as a result of a connection between a church that existed where they resided before in California. It was a white church, and they contacted another church in Madison, Wisconsin, of all places. And so this family went there, and that church rented a really nice home for them. The kids went to the local schools. The daughters were twins, and they were very popular in the high school. And even though the family, especially the father, I think, had a hard time making a living, nonetheless, they enjoyed their childhood in Wisconsin. And then there are other cases of a large extended family where they initially settled on land which was not actually viable. And so the family actually ended up being very hungry and almost starving. And the father wrote to the War Relocation Authority and asked if they could be interned, because at least that way they would be fed. And the War Relocation Authority basically said, no, you cannot come to the camp. So they had to soldier on. And the kids, it was a large family with, I think, 12 children. Every day when they went to school, they were greeted by other students throwing rocks at them. And then they had to run home after school as quickly as possible because they would be chased by the local kids with rocks. So I would say those are like two extreme examples in cases where Japanese Americans went to communities where they were, in a sense, the only family there.
Well, and also in the case of Tak, who Mom was referencing earlier, his family actually kind of couldn't support the number of children they had in the household, right, Mom? And so Tak actually was sent to stay with a white family on a dairy. And the idea was, that he would work on the dairy and receive room and board while he was in school. And so you also would have experience, some people who really experienced family separation. And so I think you see some of the echoes of the incarceration experience on the one hand, but then also for the self-evacuees, often this, sense of separation and the isolation from not only the larger Japanese American community, but often from one's own family. And so I know for my mother, the experience of, the recent immigration, the inhumane immigration policies of our own government, separating families, incarcerating children, that's been very traumatic for my mother to relive that. And that's very, so immediately personal for Japanese Americans. So I think that some of those stories, in terms of just the isolation and sometimes the family separation, they're very poignant, and I find them very moving. And I think it's a tribute to my mother and the interviews that she did, that people really shared very personal, painful, and often inspiring stories. And I think that they were really eager to share their stories because they have been largely excluded from the larger narrative about the Japanese American wartime experience. That people don't know about self-evacuees. It's not commonly known that there were people who did not go to camp and really had to struggle on their own and received no support whatsoever from the government. No food, no lodging. It just, that the camp experience, as bad as it was, that at least you had a roof over your head and you were guaranteed to be fed. That the self-evacuees were on their own completely, and that they, were able to persist and rebuild their lives is, to me, tremendously inspiring.
Yes, I kind of look at some of the experiences of self-evacuees as similar to that of refugees, where they go to areas where, in many cases, they're not welcome, and there's no really support structures. And sometimes, as Antonia mentioned, individual family members had ended up being separated. In some cases, sort of younger people in the family were able to just leave on their own, leaving their parents behind on the West Coast, either to go to school or because they could find some opportunities and feel that maybe they could get a job if they went somewhere else.
Thanks. Yeah, I was struck in the film by those self-evacuees who visited some of the camps and compared and contrasted their experiences outside the camp to those inside the camp. And again, there was a diversity of reactions to it. But, well, first of all, to me, that shows the irony of this. Someone is living in Utah, and there's Japanese Americans living in Utah as self-evacuees, and yet they're living near Topaz, where the camp was. And so people just like them or looked just like them were in the camp, and they were living on their own. Granted, they didn't have the support, as you said, and then others went to other places and actually visited the camps and saw their fellow Japanese Americans incarcerated, and I guess some thought that the people in the camps are better off. Others thought that, well, at least we have our freedom. But one was as bad as the other, and I think because of the uncertainties, as you captured in the film, it was really a harrowing experience for people outside the camp. But maybe comment a bit on those who actually visited the camps and had a direct comparison, and comment a bit on their reactions, which I know were mixed.
Well, again, mom could probably speak to this, based on the interviews. But I think one thing that struck me is I think that for the children, for the kids, I think there was a sense that in a way, camp could be seen as fun because the kids were able to play with each other. They were sort of less restricted or less isolated from one another. But I think that one thing that they kind of realized was that for the adults, it really was, camp was a tremendously difficult experience. And so, some of the things that I find poignant are, the fact that, some people, they had family members who passed away in camp. There was one woman who talked about the fact that part of the reason that her parents did not want to go to camp was because her mother was expecting a child, and they didn't want the baby to be born, in wherever they were going to end up. And so her sister, they relocated to Denver, and her sister was born in Denver General Hospital, whereas her cousin was born in camp and passed away as an infant. And there was a very high infant mortality rate. And so I think the idea that, they kind of felt that they were really fortunate that they, had missed that really, substandard medical treatment. And I think to your point, Gordon, about the, sort of the arbitrariness of it, one thing that struck me was that there were people in Seattle who relocated to Spokane, Washington. And so it was like, because there was a military zone. So the idea was you can't be in this military zone on the West Coast because it's too close to Japan. And so if you can move outside the military zone, there was like a 3-week window when you could leave, quote unquote, voluntarily. if you left during that 3 weeks, as long as you left the military zone, it wasn't even the state line, then you were no longer somehow a threat. And so there were people who relocated within the same state. They went from Seattle and spent the war years in Spokane, and somehow that was okay. So I think to me that really demonstrates how arbitrary it was. This, this sort of whole claim of it being a national security crisis, as opposed to, what I hope the film emphasizes, which was that much of this had to do with being a land grab, and had to do with the amount of agricultural land and crops that were being controlled by Japanese American families on the West Coast in Washington, Oregon, and particularly California, but that that those farms were then taken over through a process of both the government and farming groups working together to take control of those lands. And so I think that was, a really significant motivating factor for the forced removal of the Japanese, that I hope is not overlooked. That in the kind of narrative about wartime hysteria, it's not overlooked that this was really a long time campaign. There was an anti-Japanese movement going back 60 years, and before that, an anti-Chinese movement. And that a lot of this had to do with land, control of the land, and the value of the agricultural land and crops. And Mom, I don't know if you want to speak more to the experience of people who visited camp.
Oh, well, I was going to say, I think especially for young people who were in some sense removed from Japanese American community, I think visiting the camps, especially for younger people, was an opportunity to interact with other Japanese Americans. So I think that sort of speaks to, in a sense, the kind of loss that the younger people experienced if they had lived in places like Los Angeles, where there was an active, Japanese American community that they were part of, and then they had to go to areas where they were the only family, or they only had some extended family, but no other, people that Japanese Americans that they could interact with. So I think the opportunity to visit the camps and participate in some of the activities there, especially young people with dances or sports and that kind of thing, that was also their way of somehow maintaining contact and relations in the Japanese American community.
Thanks. So I'd like both of you to tell us what your current projects are, starting with Antonia and then going to Evelyn.
Well, just working on this film, which we're also preparing for broadcast on public television, and so we're working on just producing an hour-long version of it for broadcast. And our presenting station is KVIE, which is the Sacramento PBS station. So we're working with them. And then my next documentary project after this will focus on the Miss Saigon casting scandal from 1990, when the initial production of the musical Miss Saigon was being brought from London to Broadway, and they had cast a Welsh actor to play a Vietnamese character, and there was protest from the Asian American theater community against, what was essentially yellowface, and there was this tremendous conflict about whether or not the production would go forward with its casting, and people really sort of took sides about sort of not dictating to artists who they can cast or how they can create their art, versus kind of the politics of casting and the politics of art and commerce. And I think to me, it was a really important moment in Asian American activism. And I feel like it has ramifications today in terms of, who's entitled to depict what stories are and are not being told. The fact that, the vast majority of stories still being told don't represent the kind of diversity of experiences in this country. So I feel like that particular moment for me speaks to the current moment, and I think it deserves kind of unpacking and investigating. So that's my next project after this one.
Thanks, Evelyn. Do you want to tell us what your current projects are?
Yeah, I am working on a book about the self-evacuees, and I think that will be maybe trying to make sort of more generalizations as well as telling the individual stories that I think is, given how much they shared, how much personal stuff that the interviewees shared with me, I feel like their individual stories should be told in a more holistic way. So that's one project. And the other project that I've been working on is looking at the US as a settler colony and what are the implications of that for what might be called minorities that I think there's this kind of mythology that the US is a nation of immigrants, when in fact, there were people already here, namely Native Americans. And it's only been in the last maybe 5 to 7 years that I've sort of taken that seriously and wanted to look at the implications of the kind of removal of Native Americans, essentially a kind of founding violence against Native Americans that the US is based on, and what that means, not only for what might be called the white settler population, but what that means in terms of other immigrant groups that came, and what is their relationship to that, I guess you could call it the racial order that was established in the original founding of the United States.
Thank you, Antonia and Evelyn, for spending time with the DisOrient audience and making films that teach us about AAPI history and experiences. And I encourage the audience to see this film and to follow the filmmaker and support her work, and to follow Evelyn as well. And make sure you rate all the films you see, because your favorite film could receive an Audience Choice Award. I wish both of you continued success, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Gordon. Thank you to you and to the whole DisOrient team. We really appreciate this opportunity, and we're very happy to be part of this great festival. Thanks very much.